Good morning. I hope everyone has their coffee this morning. Welcome to the 6th and final day of the Alaska Historical Society Conference. I'll be your moderator today. My name is Angela Schmidt. I'm a film archivist with the Alaska and Polar Regions Collections and Archives at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm also a board member of the Alaska Historical Society. I owe my involvement in AHS to my mentor and grad school advisor, Terrence Cole, who Ron Inouye spoke so eloquently of yesterday during the memorial segment of the annual business meeting. I want to thank Ron for doing that and for sharing that tribute. I wish Terrence was with us today because I know he'd be so interested in all of these topics that we're about ready to hear about. Today, I'm speaking to you from my office in Fairbanks, my home office. My husband and I are the current owners and caretakers of a historical home which was built in 1905 by Falcon Joslin, who established the Tanana Valley Railroad, which served the goldfields here in the Fairbanks area during the early part of the 20th century. The house is about 5 blocks from the Chena River, and it sits on the ancestral lands of the Dene people of the lower Tanana River. I count myself lucky every day to be surrounded by so much rich culture and history and to be in the company of so many wonderful and interesting people who are both so generous in sharing their cultural knowledge and who are interested in exploring history and pondering its effects and meaning on our lives today. So we have a varied and interesting set of presenters ready to speak to you today. This session is titled Interior Alaska, but I'm not sure that title is fully accurate. Perhaps we should have called this session Almost Last, but certainly not least. I'm going to introduce all of our presenters and then we'll let them go to it. Our first presenter, Rachel Cohen, is going to speak about the Alaskan capital that never was and the proposed move of the state capital from Juneau to an area north of Anchorage. Rachel is my colleague at the Alaska and Polar Regions Collections and Archives at UAF, where she has served for 2 years as an archivist. She's been sharing some of her research with me on the topic that she's going to be presenting today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what facets she's going to highlight for us because this truly is a boundless and engaging subject matter. Rachel was born in Wrangell, grew up in Juneau, ventured outside to obtain degrees in library and information science and theater history and literature from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She worked for several years as an archivist in Alabama, but we were fortunate to lure her back to her home state in 2019. And her parents are listening in today too, so that's kind of fun. Our second presenter is Erik Johnson, who is a fellow member of the Alaska Historical Society Board of Directors. His topic today is the Centennial of the first headquarters of Mount McKinley, aka Denali National Park. Erik is today the park historian at Denali National Park and Preserve after taking a somewhat circuitous route to get here. He grew up near Denver, and after earning a bachelor's degree in international affairs from the University of Colorado Boulder, he worked for a time as an English teacher in South Korea. But eventually he returned stateside to pursue and earn a master's degree in history from George Mason University in Virginia. This led to work with the National Park Service, which eventually landed him back in Alaska. One of Erik's recent achievements was helping to complete a nearly decade-long effort to include the Denali Park Road on the National Register of Historic Places. As park historian, Erik explores and documents Denali's rich history, which we're excited that he's sharing with us today. And thirdly, Keely O'Connell is a graduate student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks with a primary focus on nonfiction writing. She also confesses to a keen interest in ski joring, small engine repair, and migratory bird identification. Today, she's going to be sharing with us the story of Caro, Alaska, which she first stumbled across during a boat trip up a remote Alaska river. And I wonder if this is the trip that also inspired her to become interested in small engine repair. I don't know, I guess we're going to find out about that. Keely grew up along the coast of Maine and took off to have adventures as soon as she could. She spent some years in the classroom as a teacher, first in Arkansas, then in rural Alaska. Writing nonfiction gives her an excuse to spend time outdoors doing things that might someday be worth writing about. So I think everyone can agree that we have a really good list of presenters today. Some housekeeping first, though. Each of the presenters has 20 minutes to give their talk, and I'm going to break in at about 5 minutes to the end of that to just remind them that they have 5 minutes left. to the audience, if you have questions, please drop them in at any time in the chat box. Don't use the Q&A function, please use the chat. And please make sure that it is set not to hosts and panelists, but to everyone, so that everyone can see the questions that you're dropping in. And we're not going to answer those in real time. We're going to wait till the end to answer them, but please do drop them in at any time. I think that is all that we have for housekeeping. If I've forgotten anything, I'll let people know between the different presentations. But for now, Rachel, I would like to turn the floor over to you. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. Let me just get my screen shared here.
You bet. This always takes a few minutes to.
Yeah, this is always a little bit of an adventure for everybody. Okay, so I hope people can see.
It looks good.
Okay, excellent. Good. So good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming to one of the last panels of the conference. Today, I'm going to talk to you about something that I was very surprised as a lifelong Alaskan, I actually didn't know about. I knew there had been an attempt to move the capital to Willow. I did not know there had ever been a utopic city designed to be placed outside Willow, which is about 35 air miles from the center of Anchorage. What I'm not going to do today is talk about every capital move, ballot attempt, or legislative action. That would take a book, and we only have 20 minutes. What I am going to talk about is the one that actually passed, which was in 1974. And the planning for a new capital city outside Anchorage at Willow continued until 1982, when everything collapses, rather like a meringue in a humid day. I am still, I should make very clear, early in my research, and there is a great deal more depth, which we could definitely dive into. As many of us know, the capital moves from Kodiak to Sitka, and then from Sitka to Juneau in the 19th century. Though Juneau is enshrined as the capital in the Alaska State Constitution, there was debate over moving the capital city as early as 1959, largely spurred on by Robert Atwood. Atwood was the editor of the Anchorage Daily Times, and many people view Atwood as the primary originator of the desire to have the capital moved out of Juneau to the Cook Inlet area. Critics claim over the next 2 decades that Atwood invented the capital move issue, largely to sell newspapers or as part of his own political ambitions. Between 1960 and 1962, there were 2 ballot measures to move the capital from Juneau to somewhere in the rail belt area. Both, as you can see, failed. While the 1962 pamphlet, Let's Build a Capital, rails against the expensive Juneau as the capital city, it also suggests that people of Alaska can have a modern utopic capital city, but will only have to pay for legislative buildings, which will need to be built in Juneau anyway. This tension between building a capital city that the pro-move forces advocate, but not wanting to pay for anything but a legislative office building, is eventually a sort of cognitive dissonance, which really can't survive the reality of fiscal processes, and in the end, will destroy the Willow Move project. In the 1970s, Frank Harris, the owner of a dry cleaning company in Anchorage and an Alaskan state senator in the early 60s, bases his 1970s failed re-election campaign around moving the capital from Juneau. From the 1970s to the 1980s, Frank Harris will end up leading a variety of committees in support of moving the capital. He will become so associated with the capital move project that opponents of the capital move will eventually name a ballot initiative after him. Arguments in favor of the capital move range from the capital's isolation, a serious issue involving time zones. At the time, Southeast was the only portion of Alaska in Pacific time, and a general feeling that the people working in Juneau were out of touch with the people of Alaska. The sentiment that Juneau is not really Alaskan is quite pervasive. Questioning the legitimacy of Alaskan identity is very much a part of the political messaging surrounding the idea of moving the capital. Juneau is described by Edward Paul Boyko as geographically eccentric, anachronistic, and economically unfeasible. And if you've never had a chance to read Boyko's extremely bombastic editorials in the All Alaskan Weekly, I highly recommend them. They are quite a hoot. Next to Alaska Native land claims, the issue of the capital move seems to have been the hottest topic in election reporting in the early 1970s. But the federal senators are judiciously silent, I should say, on the issue. Anti-move forces argue that moving the capital will be too expensive and that Juneau will be economically devastated if the capital moves. However, that argument does not hold much sway, and the ballot measure passes in 1974. You will note the ballot measure does not, in fact, name a city, but it does require a city to be built. You will also notice that they state the state will fund capital facilities, and it's actually kind of going to come up a little bit later that this is capital with an A, not capital with an O. Capital with an O would suggest that it is simply a capital building, but capital facilities with an A suggests all of the things you need to run a government. The process that develops to create a new capital city starts with the Capital Site Selection Committee, moves to the Capital Site Planning Commission, and then would have eventually moved to the Capital City Development Corporation, had the project ever gotten that far. Sites throughout the state are assessed. Each had to have 100 square miles of available free land, and then were further assessed on 18 criteria, including locations of roads, soils, temperatures, lack of permafrost, and of course, proximity to services like airports. Now, you might be thinking, as many of us probably are, that Willow is probably too close to Anchorage. Willow is, after all, less than 30 air miles from Anchorage. However, the committee interpreted the 30-mile rule to be measured from the center of the city, not from the edge of the city, in a 5-4 vote, putting Willow just barely within the required distance at 35 miles. Estimates of costs were compiled based on the site's geographic features, and in these suggested that Mount Yenlo, which was the most rural site seen here, would be the most expensive. Willow would be the cheapest. Exactly how much the capital city would cost remains extremely vague. Papers throughout Southeast, Fairbanks, and other parts of the state seem to support this Larson Lake site, which was outside Talkeetna. Frank Harris himself supported Larson Lake or Mount Yenlo. Meanwhile, it should be noted, the people of Larson Lake organize against the capital move, or pardon me, the people of Talkeetna organize against the capital move and advocate that they absolutely do not want it at Larson Lake. I do think one of the really sort of ironic parts of all this is that you have one group fighting to move the capital out of Juneau, one group trying to keep the capital in Juneau, and then a bunch of people in Talkeetna being like, we don't want the capital anywhere near us. So there's just this really interesting kind of three-way tension happening. And you can see here where the Willow site would have been. And Willow does end up being selected by 50% of the voters. So it wins by quite a landslide. Over the next 2-year period, the Capital Site Planning Commission worked to develop a plan for a new capital city of about 37,000 people, which was what the people at the time thought the population of Juneau would be in 1994. It should be noted that Juneau's capital today is only about 32,000, so that was a pretty high estimate. The planning wasn't just about soil drainage and utilities. They also attempted to define what would make a city uniquely Alaskan. The studies examined by the Site Planning Commission suggested that only about 20% of residents in the state at the time were actually Alaskan. The rest had migrated from the other 49 states. And they believed that people moved to Alaska to get away from urban complexity, organized government, and population density. According to their documents, Alaskans highly prize self-sufficiency, but also neighborliness and a sense of community. They prefer local solutions to problems and distrust intellectual or professional judgments. A few highlights from their assessment include that Alaska's lifestyle requires a scenic landscape free of human abuse, a friendly community atmosphere, and the ability to build one's own home, cut one's own firewood, sew one's own clothes, and know how to repair your own appliances. For some reason, the appliance example they choose is televisions, which seems a little odd to me, but there you go. They also identify sensory deprivation, cabin fever, and alcohol as major issues that will need to be addressed, as well as wildlife. The location in Willow is in the path of a moose migratory path. They also observe that people in Alaska often have a pack rat, or what they call a bush aesthetic, which they describe as people having odds and ends scattered around their properties, which I think is a very polite way of saying people have abandoned cars and 55-gallon oil drums. The final plans don't actually accommodate for this particular behavior pattern, but they do say that people should be allowed to select colors for their homes as long as these colors are pre-approved by the city's HOA. So there you go. There's very little discussion of Indigenous cultural groups in any of the design documents, except that they encourage that housing for elderly or non-nuclear family groups be considered. And they also note that some groups like to congregate in outdoor spaces to observe activities and see friends. This is really the only time that the needs for anyone other than newly arrived white Alaskans is acknowledged in any of the design documents. They also recommend playing down the image of big government and the built environment, though no plan to do this is ever particularly explained. In the end, they propose a large capital complex, a very robust public transportation system with its own lanes on roads, a shopping area which would only allow buses, not cars, everything to be walking distance from neighborhoods, schools would be located by parks, a unified heating system that would heat the majority of public buildings, and a glassed over central commons that would be a place to gather in the winter. And what you can see in this illustration from the capital planning project design is that the center of the city would contain the government and the legislature, a community facility, various stores, as well as a hotel. And then all of the neighborhood development would happen outside around this line in sort of an oval shape. The lots would be about half an acre, and they would not sell larger than half-acre lots, which does cause some political disturbance. They also design a glassed-in central commons, which would allow engagement between the public and the legislature. The idea being that all government buildings would allow movement into this public commons area. While all this is happening and all this planning is going on, there are some other things moving behind the scenes. Bill Ray, Juneau's longtime legislator, is working to fund and build as much capital facility construction in Juneau as humanly possible, trying to reduce the chances that the capital will move, or if the capital is going to move, increase the expense to the point that people will not want to do it. And this is when the Diamond Courthouse gets built, the state office building, there's major road projects in Juneau. You can draw a pretty straight correlation between this attempt to move the capital to Willow and all of this planning and a ton of construction that gets done in Juneau. So in 1978, this report comes out where all these images come from. And they have to figure out how to fund this whole thing. And I see that Joe is not muted and is laughing, because the question of how to fund this whole thing is, in fact, a really, really big problem. Normally in Alaska, municipalities, can issue bonds to do improvements to cities like roads and hospitals. They pay the interest on these bonds. Part of the money comes from the state. I've learned more about the state's municipal bonding process in the last 3 months than I honestly ever wanted to know. But there's a technical problem that no one really knows how to deal with. And that is that the capital city doesn't actually have a population. You can't build a city which is supposed to supply services to 3,000 people who are going to move from Juneau with their jobs if nothing is there. And this technical issue really sort of becomes the issue that in a lot of fundamental ways destroys this whole plan. Initially, they believe that the cost to the city will be about 2.3 billion in escalated dollars, and that will come out to 966 million in bonds, an additional 966 million in bonds. An additional 1.36 billion would come from the state general fund over the course of 14 years. The state did have enough money, by the way, in 1974 to pay for this. So I do want to make that particular phenomenon clear. However, that is so much money that one site planning commission member, Byron Malott, resigned shortly after the commission finished their report to the legislature, saying that the plan was fiscally irresponsible and public policy insanity. Meanwhile, up in Fairbanks, partly funded by Alaskans United, which is the anti-move group that forms in Juneau, and organized by Mary Nordale, a group known as the Frustrated Responsible Alaskans Needing Knowledge, aka the Frank Initiative, named in honor of Frank Harris, develops a goal, which is to highlight the price tag of the capital city in construction to convince people that it's simply too expensive.
You have about 5 minutes.
Thank you. They create an initiative that says that all costs of capital relocation must be determined prior to moving. And it's very important to know this is all bondable costs, not all costs which could potentially be paid for with a bond. They demand that the bondable costs include facilities equal to those in the current capital, those required by the 1974 Capital Move Initiative, which clearly states that a city will be built, and that also they examine the social, economic, and environmental impact on the present site, which would be Juneau, and all of the relocation sites. Multiple attempts are made to strip the Frank Initiative of its all bondable costs of the capital relocation be approved requirement, because this language means, as I said, all costs that could be bonded need to be accounted for, including an attempt to force the Alaska Marine Highway to be funded the same way. Other proposals form, suggesting a split move or potentially a capital building only suggestion. But these are seen to violate the 1974 law, which states a capital city will be constructed and capital facilities will be constructed. During this extremely bitter fistfight, Governor Hammond threatens to veto any changes made by the legislature to the Frank Initiative, and simultaneously threatens to walk up to Willow with the state seal under one arm and the lieutenant governor over his shoulder, if that is what it takes to get the voters what they voted for in 1974. Though I should note that Hammond is on the record repeatedly stating that he thinks the entire thing is too expensive and is absolutely a bad idea. In 1982, under the requirement of the Frank Initiative, the estimates for the total cost of the city was nearly 2.8 billion, with 348 million to be covered by land sales, which would have dropped the total cost to 2.5 billion. There is a big debate here involving all of these numbers. There's an earlier Boeing report which suggests the cost would be less in the 700 to 400 million range. And I think the basic observation that I've made after reading far more financial documentation on attempting to estimate the cost of this entire thing than I ever wanted to when I started my project has been that all of these numbers are pretty fictitious. Like they're not, it's really tough to estimate how much a construction project is going to take. But the final number that ends up on the ballot is that 2.8 billion, at which point the project fails. And the ballot initiative is written in such a way that if the majority of the state votes yes, it will proceed. And if the majority votes no, all the laws and initiatives relating to the capital relocation and indemnification are repealed. And as we all know, this ends all discussion Alaska ever has on the topic of moving the capital. If we were in person, that's where I would pause and wait for awkward laughter. The fact is that this problem and this issue does not go away, and it is still here with us today. And I spent a lot of time as I was doing all this research trying to decide what the point was. In the end, how do we assess the Willow Capital Move project? And how do we look at the capital move in general? And what I was finally struck by was a 1959 letter to the editor Robert Atwood, where Senator Egan wrote that even the discussion of moving the capital city from Juneau to another city, specifically Anchorage in this case, was destructive to the solidarity of Alaska. And Willie Hensley writes the same thing in 1974, that the issue of the capital move merely lends fuel to an unhealthy regionalism that is already a huge part of Alaskan politics. And it's, I think, this concept of the damage to solidarity, which brings the Willow Move project into focus today. The reflections of this bitter political fight are still very much a part of the Alaskan cultural landscape, to the point where in 1994, when there was another ballot initiative to move the capital to Juneau, a new Frank initiative was also placed on the ballot and remains there today. All bondable costs of any future capital move will have to be voted on by voters. But they definitely named it the Frank initiative for a reason. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. And let me start my video there too. Thanks, that was really interesting. At the part where you paused for awkward laughter, I didn't have my mic on, but I was laughing awkwardly.
Yeah, I was struck by that because there were some people who did say, like, if we just settle this in 82, it'll solve all of our problems. I was thinking, sure it will. Yeah, guys, that's gonna happen.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much for that. And without further ado, we're gonna move along to our next presenter. And we're going to hear about Denali Park. So take it away, Erik Johnson. Thanks.
Thank you, Angie. Appreciate your introduction earlier.
And it looks like I can see your PowerPoint just fine.
Is it up there? Okay.
Yep, I can see it. Yep.
Great, thank you. And thanks to everyone that's spending your Saturday with us. I appreciate people attending. I just want to start off by acknowledging that I live and work on the traditional homelands of the Upper Kuskokwim, Koyukon, Lower Tanana, Atna, and Dena'ina people. And I guess there's a slide that sort of shows where the outline of Denali National Park and Preserve is. In the spirit of this year's conference theme, my presentation is a brief attempt to remember Denali National Park's first headquarters on the centennial of its first administration in 1921. I will reflect on some of the communities and activities that were already present when the park's first employee arrived, but now those communities only exist in the evidence they left behind. And I imagine most of my Alaska-centric audience has visited Denali National Park and might have a memory of what the entrance and headquarters looks like right now. The current headquarters where I work has been in its location since about 1925. If you visited the sled dog kennels, that is the present headquarters area. And by the way, the kennels is celebrating their centennial with public events happening in the next 2 years or so, so keep an eye out for that. So to place the original 1921 headquarters in context, we must go back a few years. Mount McKinley National Park was established in 1917. This was largely due to the efforts of the hunter naturalist Charles Sheldon, who had visited the region in 1906 and again in 1907-08 to study the park's wildlife. Sheldon was a member of the politically influential Boone and Crockett Club, a hunter conservationist organization that was founded by Teddy Roosevelt. While Sheldon was traveling and studying wildlife on the north side of the Alaska Range, he was being guided by a man named Harry Karstens. Sheldon hatched the idea of a Denali National Park, even using the name Denali, during his time, and when he returned to the East Coast, he started lobbying for it. There is Harry Karstens on the left during Sheldon's 1908 excursion. And as you can see, a lot of bear skins that they're studying, apparently. This looks like it was at the Tokline cabin site that Sheldon had built with Karstens. Karstens was a Klondike veteran who had tried his hand at mining, but ultimately thrived in the mail and freighting business. He became a well-respected guide for various expeditions throughout interior Alaska in the early part of the 20th century and was a part of the first summit of Denali in 1913. During Sheldon's explorations into the Denali region between 06 and 08, he photographed some of the communities and people who were working, living, and subsiding near or in the region he envisioned being Denali National Park. And some of these photos are the earliest and only evidence we have of some of these places. Following the park's establishment in 1917, Sheldon lobbied for Harry Carstens to become the first superintendent of the park. Sheldon respected his abilities, work ethic, knowledge of local conditions, and even though Sheldon and other conservationists had achieved a national park, it just remained a park in name only because Congress did not provide funding. There was a world war going on, followed by a pandemic, so a national park in a territory very far away from Washington, D.C. Was not a high priority. The park was also not a priority when Sheldon initially introduced the idea to his fellow Boone and Crockett Club members in 1909. It only gained momentum following the passage of the Alaska Railroad Act. When conservationists learned that the railroad from Seward to Fairbanks would flank the east side of the game refuge Sheldon considered critical, they organized to make the park bill happen. As I mentioned before, the park bill passed and there was no funding, but after the war ended, railroad construction resumed at a rapid pace. The camps needed food and they became small settlements. Market hunters and laborers slaughtered game to essentially feed the development. The presence of railroad camps at Keely and Riley Creek in the vicinity of the eastern border of the newly established park had conservationists very concerned, and they finally were able to get a park appropriation for Mount McKinley National Park to hire its first staff. Finally, a superintendent would be hired, and that person would be charged with creating an administrative presence by building a headquarters, establishing the rule of law inside the national park, and assisting with the development of a road and other tourist functions. After years of lobbying, Harry Carstens got the job and was appointed on April 12, 1921. His appointment also put him in charge of Glacier Bay and Katmai, which were both recently established national monuments. Other serious candidates for the superintendent position included Fairbanks saloon keeper Bill McPhee, W.B. Rayburn, who was a member of the U.S.-Canada Boundary Survey, and territorial game warden Stephen Foster, who also has a great photograph collection that shows us what was in the region before the National Park Service took over. So what was Denali area like when the first appointed superintendent showed up in June 1921? This is what it looked like. The Alaska Railroad was almost completed, and small settlements had developed around numerous railroad stations. This shows the Riley Creek area that is near the current entrance of Denali National Park. This is in 1921 before the Riley Creek Railroad Bridge was completed, but it's within the alignment of the Alaska Railroad Survey. You can see the first Marina Roadhouse on the right, and construction of his second roadhouse is on the bench above. The winter after this photo was taken, the Riley Creek Bridge was constructed in just 2 months. And this photo shows the Riley Creek camp in the winter of 1921-22. You can get an idea of the camp size that had come into the area to work on the railroad. Carstens needed a site, a headquarters site near where the McKinley Park Station was being built. But commercial interests looking to capitalize off the railroad camps and the potential of a new park tourism had already taken much of the prime real estate around Riley Creek near where the station was built. And if you look closely on these maps, you can see some of the railroad stops often correlated with smaller substantial settlement development. And Cantwell, Windy, and Healy, to name a few, are all close to the eastern border of the park. There's a railroad schedule that shows all the stops. That's from 1922. The Windy Railroad Station wasn't inside the park in 1921, but would be after the park expanded. This photo, unfortunately, only shows the top of the buildings that were there. I went to survey the area with some archaeologists in 2020, and there are substantial building ruins and historic trash scattered everywhere. This chart shows some of the park's gateway communities and their populations over time. Obviously, it was challenging or near impossible for guys like census worker F.L. Forbes to get account for all of Alaska's population in 1920, but their efforts provide us with valuable research tools. The 1920 census gave us a nice record of the people living in Kantishna, It provided data on the place of birth, parents' place of birth, occupation, age, race, sex, and education level. Many of the Kantishna miners listed here were European immigrants, but we'll revisit Kantishna in a little bit. Back to Karstens. In 1921, he traveled from the lower 48 and planned to work at a Nenana while he staked out the park's headquarters. He traveled with Woodbury Abbey, who worked for the General Lands Office and was starting work on the National Park Boundary Survey. Abbey would later become a short-term resident of McKinley Park Station. Nenana at the time was a northern hub for the Alaskan Railroad, so there was some infrastructure in place for Karstens to start planning the beginning of Mount McKinley National Park. He was working out of an Alaska Engineering Commission building and using the Nenana telephone exchange building to communicate with his higher ups. It's this next slide. It's not clear if he was living at the Cooney Hotel, but he was often there, and that's where his wife Frida Louise and son Eugene stayed when they finally joined him later in 1921. And back to the McKinley Park headquarters, Harry selected a site on the north side of Riley Creek as the park's headquarters. This was in the summer of 1921. He had to spend part of the summer conducting long patrols through the park to Copper Mountain to Kantishna mining districts. So he didn't start clearing land for the park headquarters until the fall. He lived in a wall tent until he could finish his cabin, which happened in December of 1921. And this all happened just as Riley Creek Bridge construction was getting underway. His wife Frida and young son joined him at Riley Creek that December. He continued to build and ended up completing the headquarters buildings in 1922. And you can see this is what the early park headquarters looked like. And he finally starts getting more help at the very end of 1921 and at the beginning of 22. He was working by himself for much of this time. And I'm just going to briefly go over some of the other buildings that were in the area in 21 and 22. On the south side of Riley Creek was Lynch's Roadhouse, which was the enterprise of Patrick Lynch. He was a Klondike veteran. He had a 24-horse barn, a warehouse, blacksmith shop, bunkhouse, ladies' cabin, and a mess house. He had set up this operation to cater to the railroad camp, and by the summer of 22, he actually left this roadhouse and set up a new operation in Healy. These two buildings here, these two buildings contain businesses that cater to the railroad camp in winter of 21-22. The one on the right was a trading post and bunkhouse run by Mary Thompson. And I have an interesting anecdote about her if I get it. I might be able to get to it later if there's time. And the one on the left was a restaurant run by Jack Donnelly. These buildings no longer remain. This is the McKinley Park Cigar Store in 1941. Cigar store was often a euphemism for brothel or liquor store. The bone dry law was in effect back in 1921, so bootleggers emerged within the Riley Creek and McKinley Station area. And the main presence at Riley Creek during the early years of Mount McKinley National Park was Maurice Marino. And there he is walking on the Riley Creek Bridge. And I always feel a little bit creeped out by this photo. Marino was born in Italy in 1870. He stampeded to Nome in 1900 and then followed gold strikes to Fairbanks and Vault Creek. Around 1910, he was prospecting drainages in the Riley Creek area and built a cabin by 1914. With the announcement of the Alaska Railroad alignment, coupled with the establishment of a new national park, Marino turned his attention to the hospitality industry because he was located in the perfect spot to capitalize on it. He built his first roadhouse, which was dubbed the Park Gate Hotel. Many people loved Marino, but Karstens was not a fan, and the two of them often clashed. By 1921, Marino had filed for a 120-acre homestead claim near the proposed McKinley Station Railroad Depot, and he began building his second roadhouse. The roadhouse would eventually offer 20 to 25 sleeping rooms, a trading post, a post office, and a restaurant. And Marino was arrested several times for possession and intent to sell homebrew, but his cases were dismissed. And there is a video on the Alaska Digital Archives that shows a train arriving and going by Marino Roadhouse. If there's time at the end, I'll run a clip of that. Marino's operation thrived during the mid-20s. He built rental cabins, a schoolhouse, and he planted barley and hay on 30 acres of land, which apparently surprised arriving tourists. Marino passed away and was buried on his acreage, but was eventually sold to the Park Service. So now his tomb lays inside Denali National Park, along with a couple other McKinley Station residents you can see on the lower right side there. The upper right is an interpretive sign marking the spot of Marino's second roadhouse that burned down in 1950. And I'm just going to read a quick quote from Tom Walker's book, McKinley Station, that sort of embodies what was going on at McKinley Station at the time. Quote, "The area near McKinley Station, near the Riley Viaduct, was a volatile place, populated in part by moonshiners, ne'er-do-wells, and prostitutes, and was known as the Hole. Drunken brawls, thefts, and vicious cursing marred spring nights. The crack of big guns firing in the winter darkness woke residents on the bluff and engendered fear. The volatile mix of sloth, greed, and illegal alcohol led to fights and injuries that quickly drew the attention of the marshals. Frequently, inebriates were the first people that park tourists met when descending from the train at McKinley Park Station." Wild West indeed. So why did the first park headquarters move locations after just 3 years? The rowdy neighbors didn't help, and a flood in 1923 was not ideal. There was also a massive fire in 1924, and winter temperatures stayed brutally cold down by the river. And I'm trying to paint the scene of what the McKinley Station was like when Carson's arrived and had to build or start building operations from scratch. And almost nothing remains of this period, but the McKinley Station Trail that leads from the Denali Visitor Center passes by all these places that once existed. If you know how to read the landscape, you can see some of the ruins. 100 years ago this year, Harry Carsons rode into a daunting situation, building a park administrative presence from scratch, alone, with few resources, in a place that was unforgiving and sometimes hostile. Although his first headquarters location failed, like so many times before, he adapted and built a solid foundation on higher ground, and that foundation still stands in the headquarters we have today. And now I want to briefly take you to some mining related communities that existed in place when Carsons was appointed 100 years ago, and ones that he had to go and patrol right away when he arrived. The Kantishna mining district had gone through a stampede in 1905 and 1906, but mostly emptied out after all the major placer gold drainages were staked. However, following the end of World War I and an increase in the price of silver, a renewed optimism about the mining district took hold. The railroad still wasn't completed, so the only way to get to the Kantishna Hills remained traveling the Tanana to the Kantishna River and then overland at a settlement called Roosevelt. Doc Sutherland, who had organized the Kantishna Hydraulic Mining Company, was one of the optimists. In the lower right corner, you can see his operation at Roosevelt in 1920. What's interesting is how his trip is somewhat relatable to life in 2021. In 1920, the Spanish flu pandemic was ripping through Nenana. And as you can see in this newspaper report, that second paragraph says the quarantine at Roosevelt will be 5 days in duration. Nor that any of these latent cases may develop before the passengers are free to mingle with any residents of the Kantishna district. A quarantine officer will be chosen by Dr. Sutherland from among the passengers making the trip, and it will be his duty to see that all instructions are fully carried out. Sounds like a mandate. Here is the original Hanson brother trio. I'm not going to make an Mbach joke, but they were here in 1917 and they worked as trappers in Roosevelt. I had the opportunity to join a Roosevelt survey over the summer. Much was gone, but it's surprising how intact some of the buildings were considering the time that has passed. So this is from just a few months ago. And on this map, you could see Roosevelt is by the Kantishna River. And that's where people would get off, and they would travel overland, oftentimes through Glacier. And this map sort of shows Roosevelt up here, and here's Glacier here. And then the main Kantishna downtown area is this part. In the early 1920s, the railroad built small communities in interior Alaska, but it also by default took them away. Roosevelt was a settlement that grew up as a transfer point to the Kantishna mining district on the Kantishna River. And it was rendered obsolete because those miners would begin to use roads and railroads and even airplanes by that time, rather than travel by water anymore. During the early Kantishna mining period in 1905 and again in the 1920s, a place called Glacier City became an important supply point. In 1920, the commissioner of the Kantishna Mining District, C. Herbert Wilson, operated a supply store in Glacier City, and there were several cabins that were homes. There was a blacksmith shop, an office building, barn, and the headquarters for the Mount McKinley Gold Placer Company, which was operated by Billy Taylor, who was famous for summiting the North Peak of Denali in 1910. And I was also able to travel here during the summer of 2021. There were many building ruins being overgrown fast. You can see some of those here. And so these settlements were all part of the early Kantishna mining period. The main settlement in our town developed at the confluence of Eureka Creek and Moose Creek and was just called Kantishna. And it's where the Kantishna PO is located. And that's where we're headed to here. This is a photo where you can see Kantishna in 1922. One of those buildings down there is the Boucher cabin. And just as of last month, this is now on the National Register of Historic Places, which is my shameless plug. The cabin was built by Doc Sutherland's Kantishna Hydraulic Mining Company in 1922, but became associated with local miner Johnny Boucher. And another one of the main buildings in that area was the Kantishna Roadhouse, which was built in 1919 or 1920, and was also listed on the National Register. And here are some of the Kantishna buildings falling into disrepair in 1937. You can see the roadhouse in the background here. And then on the far left, I believe there's the Boucher cabin. And you just saw this slide, but I wanted to point out that the pipe you see in the foreground is a hydraulic mining pipe that Doc Sutherland's team set up near Wonder Lake and ran for several miles to Moose Creek right here. And speaking of Wonder Lake, in 1921, there was a development on the north end. The Anderson Roadhouse, which also ran a fox farm, was built there probably in the late teens. There's a roadhouse that was eventually abandoned in the 1920s and it burned down in the 1930s. And here is a photo of Doc Sutherland and Nora Sutherland, and I don't know who these guys are, but this is at that Wonder Lake Roadhouse. Here's a map. I believe it's from around 1930. You can see the roadhouse is marked on this map at Wonder Lake. And now I'm going to move to Mount Alaskan and the Copper Mountain Mining District.
You're at 20 minutes right now.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Well, I will
go ahead and wrap up.
Okay. Well, I was going to say this is another area that in 1921 saw some development. Not much was produced, but there was a lot of mining work that happened here for the next 50 years after stakes were claimed in 21. Joe Quigley and Fannie Quigley were the ones that found it. And then Frank Giles and O.M. Grant became associated with it in the 1920s. The Guggenheim family even showed some interest in it in the early 1920s, but everything came back to it was too expensive to get these minerals outside markets. So everything ultimately never sustained for very long. And if you go to Eielson Visitor Center, which many of you probably have, this is sort of the view out, and Mount Eielson's on the side here. So this whole area had a camp, and even going into the 1950s and 60s, Harold Herning ended up operating a mine, and he had a cabin here. So I will just wrap up there. There's my corny end of the road slide to indicate them at the end. This presentation is a small glimpse into some of the communities that developed before our National Parks Administration existed 100 years ago. So thank you.
Thanks, Erik. I hate to cut you off.
Oh no, I knew it was going to be close.
And I have so many questions, and I just would love to see some of those areas myself. So anyway, thanks for that presentation. And I see that there's questions coming in, but we'll address those at the end. I want to turn the floor over right now to Keely to get set up for her presentation. And we're looking forward to hearing about her adventures to Caro, Alaska. All right, take it away, Keely.
Awesome. Okay, so the theme of this conference, I guess, is communities remembered and imagined. This is more on the imagined side of the spectrum. Since I'm a writer, not a historian or an archaeologist or any of those kinds of people, this is kind of a research narrative about something that fascinated me and that I spent some time digging around in. So the story kind of started in, I guess, 2017, 2018, I guess. My boyfriend and I were teaching in Arctic Village, and we wanted to go for an adventure. So we popped in my boat and went down the East Fork of the Chandeleur River and then back up the North Fork. We were curious. There was some property for sale at Chandeleur Lake. Thought maybe we could get there. We didn't end up making it that far, but we saw some really interesting country and had some really kind of cool stuff happen. So that was my first introduction to this region. This kind of along through here that we traveled and then came around the bend here and tried to get up to Chandeleur. Along the way, we had adventures with mosquitoes, as you do in Alaska in July and June. They were awful, and my fool boyfriend dropped our electric mosquito racket zapper thing in the river, and it quit functioning during this trip, which we'll come back to later as an interesting note. We had lots of encounters with moose, once where we had a moose pretty much run through our camp, no thanks to my dog Dazrai. And another where I was pack rafting down the North Fork. We got to where we couldn't go anymore and hiked up a little ways with our pack rafts and floated back down. And I came around a bend just as a moose came out of the trees with her calf. And I got caught on riffles, and she got stood right there in the middle of the riffles, and she was maybe 15, 20, 30 feet away. I don't know, real close, stared at me while her calf walked behind her, and I thought I was about to die. So we had all kinds of adventures. There were rapids. We weren't sure how far we were going to be able to go, and we kept going after we were pretty sure we should have stopped. So I kept journals throughout this time, and I'm really glad I did. There's some interesting reflection in my journal about solitude. This was the summer with all of the fires, or one of the summers with all the fires up north of the Arctic Circle. And it was dim and hazy and weird, and I was sending out messages on my inReach and nobody was responding, and it felt really isolated. And I was surprised at how much that got to me over the course of maybe the 2 weeks that we were upriver. We didn't see another human being while we were up there, just some evidence of trashy hunters or people that had floated down and left garbage. There wasn't really much. And so we felt really alone. That's my dog. So about 2 years later, after this trip has passed and I've moved to Fairbanks, I started looking through the archives. Rachel was a huge help as I was kind of getting curious about this region, because there had been a couple mysteries on the trip, and I wanted to know more about some of the questions that I had sort of stumbled upon while out in the wilderness. It was beautiful and it was tantalizing, and I couldn't wait to go back. And I guess while I couldn't, I was trying to satisfy that itch by learning more about the area. The first thing was Caro. As Jeff and I, my boyfriend and I, were going upriver, there was a GPS mark on our map that indicated that there was a town on the shore, but when we stopped, there was nothing there. We knew there was nothing there. We'd both lived in the region for quite a while, and it didn't make sense that there would be a town on this river, but the GPS said there was. So we stopped and we poked around, but we didn't see anything at all. There didn't appear to be anything left. Maybe we weren't looking in the right place. The mosquitoes were pretty bad, so we didn't spend much time on it, but it stuck in my mind. A little further upriver, we did find a ruined cabin, the remains of a cabin, and I marked it on my my map, made a waypoint because it was curious right there on the shore. There were some objects in and around it that we kind of came across, this Lipton's tea canister and this frying pan. I had pictures of them, So when I started digging into this research a little bit more, I tried to figure out when they were from. I found a dead ringer for the tea canister, but I couldn't find a date for it. I did find that the pan was manufactured for like 70 years, 80 years. So that wasn't really helpful. Maybe the best clue is this egg crate. I found the National Baker's Egg Company egg crate out there in at this cabin, and kind of made a note of that. And the best date that I could get for that was from a book about how to go camping, just by this guy named Stuart Edward White, that was written in 1911. And he mentions these were the best canned eggs, powdered eggs, I guess. So I had questions. When was the cabin used? Whose lives had we kind of brushed against out there? There were no living people. So who were the ghosts, and what were their stories? Again, I'm a writer, so this is what really got me excited. When I came to Fairbanks, I came as a writer. I'm a creative writing grad student, and I wanted to find out more about this area. I thought maybe this could be, I don't know, a story that I would tell. So in the archives, there's a collection called the Cyril P. Wood Papers, and CP, as he was called, he was a really young man at the time, and he lived in Caro for 2 years running the Northern Commercial Company's trading post. He had to close it down in 1908 because of insufficient business. And he tells this great story about how he went to go collect payment from all of the miners that were upriver. He had to close the post, hike up there, and then collect all of their payment in gold dust, and then come back downriver. And he ended up canoeing out with all that gold dust to go turn it over to the Northern Commercial Company. But while on this trip, he talked to Oat Nicholson, who was a miner, and Oat said, "Hey, keep an eye out for my dog. He's been missing for a few days." And as CP was hiking back down to where he could get in his canoe, he found the dog in a hole in the ground. I guess it was an abandoned mining exploration thing, and pulled him out and really bonded with this dog. It's really kind of a sweet story. So he takes him downriver, and he turns him over to this guy named Wada in Caro. And apparently the dog tried to follow him downriver, and CP shed a tear because he had to leave his friend behind. It's just a really sweet little moving story. He shared some bacon and some rice with the dog on the trail and everything. And I can connect with that. Part of what I love doing outside is connecting with my dogs and having them live a little bit more exciting lives. So CP got right into my heart. It was kind of interesting, as I was thinking about CP's story about going upriver, maybe this cabin is Oat Nicholson's place. Oat gets, or someone named OJ Nicholson, probably the same guy, gets a mention in a trail report from 2007. Rolf Bazell, I'm probably saying his name wrong, but he wrote this incredible history of the area that mentions that OJ Nicholson brought the first tractor into the Chandeleur region in 1923. And the cabin's like roughly in the right place. So maybe it's Oats, maybe not. There's some more thoughts about that later. But I thought that was kind of a cool perhaps. I'm in the business of perhapsing. Back at CP's story, he wrote about continuing down the Chandeleur as far as the Indian village. That's probably Vinitai, or what would become Vinitai. And feeling kind of lonesome and nostalgic as he's passing by the trading post. And I can identify with that too. I felt my solitude really strongly as I was coming down that stretch of river. And so I felt my life had brushed against CP's in this way. So he was 110 years ahead of me, but we had a lot in common. He was a good writer, and he felt compelled to write his experiences down and share them. He connected with this dog, and he felt that melancholy lonesomeness of that stretch of river just the same way that I did. So CP's story left me with more questions. So who is Wada? What's his story? Who else was out there in Caro? What was life like in 1908 or 1907 when the trading post was open? And when was all that country abandoned, and kind of why? I didn't find anything about Wada. CP said he was a Japanese trapper with a Kobuk wife. There was a Japanese explorer called Jujiro Wada in Alaska and the Yukon in 1908, but that has to be a different guy. He was busy doing something else. I did a little reading about him. So I don't know. I think that's a really interesting chunk of history. I know there's a whole lot of information about Japanese folks and the connection to beaver. And I learned a little bit more about that later, but I still have lots of questions and lots of reading left to do. So I abandoned that inquiry for a while and got into the William Sulzer papers, which are kind of the most voluminous thing in the archives about this region. William Sulzer was a congressman eventually, who had a big financial stake in mining in this region. He sent this guy, S.J. Marsh, up to Alaska to go, or contracted with this guy to go and explore and find him some gold that he could invest in. So S.J. Marsh and Thomas Carter, who actually struck gold in the region, corresponded with Sulzer from Caro. So that's where all their letters are posted. Sulzer continued to be interested in the area until he died in the 40s. So mail was sent and received in Caro, and Caro was actually named after the daughter of the postmaster of Fairbanks at the time. And I guess there's some notes in the letters about how people felt so much less isolated when they had mail, even though it took quite a while to get there. Marsh wrote this to Sulzer in 1906 after Carter struck gold, and this kind of kicked off Sulzer's interest in the area. From all I've seen this summer and from the general outlook, I have no hesitation in saying that we have the best chance of anyone in northeastern Alaska to not only lay the foundation, but to carry out successfully a large and systematic proposition, which they sort of eventually would. The Marsh reports are really interesting. He's cruising all over the north, sending these letters back about what's successful, what's unsuccessful, and occasionally there's really interesting, strange little tidbits in there. I loved this receipt from Eagle Station. He bought one journal and one bottle of liniment, which I can really identify with as a writer, like going out and bashing around, finding adventure so that I can write nonfiction about it. 100%, get me a bottle of liniment and a journal. Marsh wrote about rapids. I could identify with that. They had some harrowing escapes, and they soaked their camera. I could identify with that too. There was my mosquito racket that no longer worked after it went in the drink. So that there aren't a lot of pictures, sadly, from the 1906 expedition. There are some cool mysteries in the Sulzer papers. There's this coded phrase. I have no idea what it says, but I thought it was neat. And there's this map with this note on it. The magic man reflecting on something says from Kayukuk to mouth of creek, 6 sleep. I mean, it's weird. I just want to know, I guess I wanted to be able to match this map up to someplace that I could go and explore and try out the directions, I guess. What a nifty little item. I haven't matched it up with any place yet, but hopefully I will sometime and get to go hang out in the area. Part of the reason that I can't go back up there and just do what I want is because it's expensive just to get out there. And that's part of the problem for Sulzer as well. And the whole comprehensive mining operation that they were trying to get going, it was just expensive. Getting anything out there, you're traveling overland or upriver, and it's a long way, whatever way you choose to go. So that's, I'm working on finding a way to get back up there. I did bring my boat down from Arctic Village to Fairbanks this summer and tried to go up the North Fork of the Chandeleur again and couldn't. The water level was too low. I was so bummed. I went about 10 miles and I had about 10 more to go. And I thought, I don't quite have time to walk it. So another time, if I get lucky. Money is definitely the most discussed thing in the correspondence. Marsh is always asking Sulzer for more money. Sulzer's always sending it. So he kind of keeps the whole thing going. They eventually do get a road built between Beaver and Caro, which is pretty interesting. I think, though, that it was not the world's greatest road, because when they tried to ship a bunch of equipment up in 1913, they had so much trouble that they ended up just sort of abandoning the equipment along the side of the trail between Beaver and Caro. Apparently it's still there. Somebody I spoke with mentioned seeing it in recent years.
You have about 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So this Marsh guy, he was kind of a shady character. There's plenty of notes in Sulzer's papers of people warning him to maybe back off from Marsh, that he might be stealing or just being not very responsible with Sulzer's cash. I don't know if that's the case. It's still a lingering question for me. Definitely seems likely. I don't like the guy. Marsh in his letters comes off as kind of a jerk. He doesn't treat his dogs or his horses very well, but he does know how to pack. Further into the Sulzer papers, kind of as you get further along in the story of this mining operation, there's some kind of interesting stuff that happens. This guy, one man at the mine shot himself accidentally. And the first telegram is like, oh no, somebody shot Patterson. And then the next one is, oh, Patterson shot himself on accident. They figured it out because he had put a rubber band or a tie on the trigger of his rifle, and had to take up some of the trigger pull, I guess. And then when he set it on the ground, it went off. Interesting story. And it was no big deal. I think maybe that was what was so weird about all this. It was just not a big deal in the paperwork. The mine at Chandeleur, Sulzer's interest anyway, it didn't really take off during his lifetime. There were just lots of bigger picture things going on that prevented him from getting more involved. War, depression, war, kind of slowed down the whole process. And then I'll talk about later in a few minutes, but I did kind of stumble across in this time period some information about the Yasudas. I don't know much about them, but I'm excited to dig into that when I finish my thesis and can get back to working on this project, because they seem like fascinating characters. Thomas Carter is the guy who struck gold and kind of set off the gold rush in the Chandeleur. His partner was a guy named Frank Yasuda, and he was more involved with setting up infrastructure. So building way stations, that kind of thing. And I know that Little Squaw Creek was named after his baby daughter. Frank Yasuda's wife gave birth to a baby girl, I think during that trip where they actually struck gold. And his wife sounds like she was an amazing woman. She would hike up and down the road from Beaver to Caro to do sewing and work for the miners at Chandeleur. So I want to learn more about her. I'd love, if anyone has resources, I'd love links and stuff. Mining declined. Eventually the road was put in, the haul road. People started going overland, and Caro kind of faded out of existence. Whatever was left of miners, and as a travel corridor, that Beaver to Caro road, it just kind of fizzled out. Aviation kind of got in there too, and people were flying stuff in instead of going overland. This is a picture from 1962 of the upper Big Creek area. And I like this old tractor. I thought, could that be Oat Nicholson's tractor that he brought in 23? I don't know. The cabin may very well have been a shelter cabin. This is a map from 1932 that shows there were several of them in that region. So perhaps that's what the story of that place is. Today, there's still an extensive mining operation up there. It's gold-rich mining. They bought Sulzer's interest and I think a couple other folks, and have continued to extract gold from that area for the intervening years, which is pretty interesting. I know some folks in Arctic Village that work over there. So I don't know, was Marsh conning Sulzer? Probably. I think it's kind of a neat story to imagine what that relationship might have been like. I'm curious what's left of Caro. I wish I'd spent more time on that first trip digging around in the woods and put my mosquito net on and just committed. Because there was so much. There was a roadhouse and like 40 cabins. So there has to be something left. I know that there was a tram that crossed the river, and there still is one on the middle fork of the Chandelar. I met some canoers that had come across that. It's kind of a navigational hazard, but I didn't see anything on the main stem, which would have gone from been on the Beaver to Caro Road. I'm very curious about the Yasudas and looking forward to learning more about them. And I really just want to get back out there again. It's an incredibly beautiful place, and I am totally enchanted by it. So someday, when I finish this degree, thank you guys for listening, and hopefully folks can share some resources with me.
Thank you for that, Keely. That was fascinating.
Thanks.
Yeah. It looks like we have about 20 minutes now for question and answers, and I see that there's lots of questions coming in right now. A lot of people are saying, great presentations to everyone. And I think maybe we'll start by kind of working backwards through the presenters. Keely, I wanted to let you know, let's see, Heather Feel says that the secret code may have been a simple Pigpen cipher. It would be worth checking out to see if it translates to something useful. So I was really captivated by that too. I thought, wow, that looks really interesting. I want to know what that says. So hopefully that's something that, you could look into. Carol Hoffler notes that there was another Japanese man in Caro named James Manano, and added that you might want to read The Child of the Equinox, the Edith Smith story by Willie Lou Warbelow. Edith discusses her childhood in Caro. She was Japanese Inuit, and her parents were associated with Navajo and Yasuda. So those are a couple of resources.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I have a question for you that relates to your journaling. Is that something that you do in everyday life, or is that more concentrated on what you do during your wilderness experiences? How do you manage that, and how does it work into your overall experience in the wilderness?
So I carry really tiny notebooks and little short stubby pencils, and I mostly just journal when I'm out doing adventure things because I figured it might be useful someday. I don't normally journal when I'm in town because it's got other writing projects to do.
Do you refer back to your journals when you are doing writing? And how do your journal entries compare to the writings of people who explored these areas in the earlier?
I guess that's kind of what this experiment or this project was about, was kind of finding the connections between my journal entries, and especially C.P. Wood, and his accounts of his stories, because there's some fun parallels, dropping things in the river so they don't work anymore, like Marsh, and reflecting on solitude. They're similar, and it's so fun to feel that connection to those people who were there before.
Yeah. Oh, that's really neat. Yeah. Thanks for sharing your experiences today.
Yeah.
Let's see. Russ says, Keely, I have some sources that may be helpful to you. So we'll try to make sure that you are able to follow up on all of these resources.
Taking notes, a little sticky.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I see they're in the chat there. Erik, working back to you. Carol asked if you could show your train film at the end of the session. So if we have time for that, maybe that's something that we can do. Ron asked, please tell us more about Dr. Sutherland.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ron, for the question, and thanks to others for the nice words of support in the chat. I need to acknowledge that Jane Bryant and Tom Walker, the late Bill Brown, Frank Norris, I'm probably missing some people, but Jane and Tom especially, they've spent so much time trying to uncover who these folks were, spent years and years and years, and they greatly contributed to what we know about it. And I work at the park now, and I try to build on what they know. Jane did some research on Doc Sutherland. His name comes up in a lot of newspaper accounts, and I'm glad we have digitized newspapers now for like the Nana News. He was a native of Toronto, Canada, and he received his medical degree and moved to Dawson City in 1898. And then we know he moved to Fairbanks in 1904 and practiced medicine there for over 40 years. I found a great quote in Jane's book that she found from a Fairbanks resident that said, "Oh, Doc Sutherland, he saved everybody in Fairbanks at least once." So he was well respected in the community. And then he his mining ambitions were something he sort of did on the side. And Jane has a nice profile of him in her book, Snapshots from the Past, but she says they passed away in 1952.
Okay. David asks, was the first park superposition a presidential appointment or interior? It's fascinating to hear about the competition for the job. And then I just as a follow-up for that, but you know, I thought it was really fascinating that one person gets to oversee this just vast, you know, region. How in the world is that even possible?
I don't even know why anyone would want to do that by themselves. There's the drama surrounding that first appointment is sort of interesting. It is an appointment by the director of the National Park Service. And it was a little bit awkward because Sheldon and Karstens had become friends when he was guiding him. Sheldon was very influential on the in the East Coast among conservationists, so his influence weighed pretty heavy. But yeah, I know that Rayburn, and this is the brother of Rayburn, who was the famous surveyor who worked with Albert Brooks. His brother Rayburn is the one that emerged as one of the candidates, and that's who the territorial governor Riggs wanted. And it seems like he had more support. And then for whatever reason, the Park Service reached out to Karstens and conducted a couple interviews and realized that he was the guy. You know, when you look at it, it seems like Sheldon was the one that was twisting arms, but it seems like the Park Service actually came to that decision after doing some interviews. And yeah, and I mean, that's the job itself is still an appointment. You know, there's not a USA Jobs application for it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Rachel, there was quite a bit of interest in the photographs, or I'm sorry, the drawings that you were showing. Carol Gale says, the document that described what Alaskans, apparently new Alaskans, would want in their ideal city. Is that document available anywhere online? It would be interesting to get a look at that. And there's a couple other couple other comments on that.
I am not aware of those documents being available online. They come from the Capital Site Planning Commission, and the color images come from a 1978 pamphlet that was mailed out in every newspaper in the state at the time. And I should give a shout out to Angie, who rescued a copy of it from Terrence Cole's house and kindly brought it to me because she knew I was working on this project. And Dermot Cole was kind enough to donate it. So I had a copy to get color images from, because the only thing I was able to pull off microfilm was, of course, in black and white. And I think the color is really impactful. The black and white line drawings come from another publication, which accompanied about 120-page final report from the Planning Commission, which was compiled by an out-of-state architecture firm. And they actually hired multiple out-of-state consultants. The design determinants of the Planning Commission is the document in which they attempt to assess what Alaskans, quote unquote, want. And there's also those same assessments are being done by the Site Relocation Committee in a variety of their documents. So I guess the long and the short answer is a longer answer that you probably needed, is to get all that information, you have to go through an awful lot of really boring survey reports and sort of track it down. But yeah, they're just if you just go into the library catalogs and look up Capital Site Planning Commission, you will find dozens and dozens and dozens of reports that they published. Some of which are fascinating. some of which are very painful.
Ron would like to know if you could gather the surviving members of the Capitol Relocation Committee for dinner, what questions would you ask?
Oh gosh. I think after I got over being horribly intimidated, I think what I would really want to know is a large number of people on the Capitol Site Planning Commission and a large number of people on the Site Selection Committee seem to be opposed to moving the Capitol. I didn't track down all of their political stances on the matter because there were a lot of them and it was a 20-minute presentation. But I get the sense, especially William Hensley, who is the head of the Site Selection Committee, is vocally opposed to moving the Capitol. And I would be very curious to know if that opposition, how they felt that opposition potentially influenced their work, and if they were still opposed to the Capitol move after they finished the planning process. I was very struck by how thorough the planning process was, and that although a lot of the members of the committee clearly were not in favor of the Capitol move, they all seemed to be very dedicated to doing an extremely good job. Which I really appreciated. I mean, the work that was done by this group of people, both the Planning Commission for the city and the Site Selection Committee, was mind-boggling to me. I cannot imagine. And if you want a sort of entertaining read on some of it, it is covered in John McPhee's Coming into the Country. He's got a good 20 pages in there, some of which are very funny, about flying around in helicopters and wild committee meetings. And I can't imagine. To have been a fly on the wall of some of those meetings, I think would have been utterly fascinating.
Excellent. Keely, I'm curious how your wilderness adventures have colored the writing that you do. And I'm wondering, is there a place where we can access some of the writings that you've done?
Absolutely. I'll put a link in the chat.
Oh, fantastic.
Some of the stuff that's been published, but yeah, it's pretty much what I write about. So I keep using writing as an excuse to go out and do things that maybe I wouldn't do if I didn't have an excuse.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And how does it tie into what you're studying at UAF?
I'm studying nonfiction writing. My thesis is going to be an essay collection that'll focus on adventures in Alaska's outdoors. So, maybe we'll see a book in the next several years here.
I think that would be fantastic, and I think that we should all be on the lookout for that. That's great.
Please.
Erik, where do you see the park going in the next 100 years?
First, we have to sort out how to keep the road open.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're following that in the news.
Yes.
Actually, I will say that climate change will factor into a lot of the park operations, as we've seen already with that landslide. It's a good question. I guess it's something I should think more about. Oftentimes we're only thinking in 5-year or 10-year planning periods. But yeah, I mean, the rise of development and tourism and continued access and rising numbers of tourists, it's all stuff that we grapple with. And, you want to give as much access to people, but you don't want them destroying the resources that we have. So it's that Park Service mission that's just, it's always a struggle. I don't have a good answer for that, but as I said, I think climate change will be definitely affecting a lot of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to draw people's attention to the chat there. I say Keely is putting some links to some of her writings. So please copy those links, and if you're interested, and check out some of her writings. Carol Gales asked, Keely, did you find any surprise birds on your river trip?
I didn't, mostly because at the time I didn't know anything about birds. This is a relatively new interest of mine, but I've spent the entire pandemic, spent the entire pandemic learning about birds. So expect more on birds in my future writing.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, we only have about 5 minutes here, but Rachel, I wanted to turn back to you really quickly. Do you think Juneau will still be our capital in 50 years?
You're asking a Juneauite. I mean, I'm biased. I think that who knows? I really don't know the answer to that question. I do think that what has happened now is sort of death by a thousand cuts. And so if you can't move the capital city in a formal sense, what you can do is you can start moving political positions out of the city, and that they have done very effectively. And so I think it becomes a question as to how Alaskans feel about the idea of the legislature meeting somewhere else, or how do Alaskans feel about the governor's office being somewhere else. And while the Frank Initiative of 1994 will protect potentially against building an entirely new capital city, I do think we need to think as a state, and I obviously have a perspective on this, that is, it should all stay in Juneau, but then again, I'm, as I said, biased, where we stand on shifting around those kinds of positions and what are the consequences of moving those positions. I think one of the things that becomes very clear the more you read about this issue and letters to the editor and, oh my goodness, different perspectives and some truly bombastic and somewhat funny writings, it just becomes increasingly clear that there is real fear from, I think, the rest of the state that Anchorage as an urban center is going to gobble everything up. And that the power of Anchorage is, and I would argue the power now of the whole Mat-Su region, is damaging to the rest of the state. There's an editorial in the Fairbanks Daily News Miner about how if Anchorage takes the capital, then won't Anchorage want the university? Which feels very threatening, I think, to people. I don't think that's necessarily a fair characterization of Anchorage. I want to make that very clear. But I do think that that fear, and that fear definitely was part of my own experience living in Juneau for most of my life, was this constant fear that the economic base would be removed. And I don't think that you can threaten to remove the economic base of a city and not have that city respond. I think that's a very frightening thing for a community. So that was really the things that really struck me, was this sort of constant tension about this reactions to this. And I would be very curious if I could go back in time to 1959 to know how much Robert Atwood pushed all of this forward, and if there would even be a debate today if his editorials had not appeared in the newspaper. I do wonder about that. He's certainly blamed by a lot of people, which I don't know if that's entirely fair, but
Okay, well, we're coming up on 11:30. I want to turn this back over to Karen Brewster, maybe to do some housekeeping if that's needed before the next session starts. But I just really want to thank all of our panelists today. This is really a fascinating session, and thanks for your time. And thanks to everyone who came and shared some coffee and some good discussions with us today.
Yeah, I had a question.
Oh, go ahead.
If we have time, Miss Moderator. It's actually for Rachel, that the involvement of Mike Gravel, and didn't he have an idea for a big utopian domed city or something, and was that connected?
I believe he did. I could not find any connection between him and this particular capital move. But there were lots and lots of weird construction proposals floating around Alaska at the height of the oil boom.
Yeah, so yeah, his proposal is definitely one of those weird ones.
Yeah, there's some oddness. There's also at one point a proposal to move the capital to Pelican, though I don't know what Pelican ever did to deserve that. There's a proposal to move the capital to Nome. There's an argument that Fairbanks is uninhabitable and therefore cannot have a capital. I feel as a Fairbanks resident, that's very offensive.
And yeah, I knew Gravel had that proposal. I didn't know if it was.
Yeah, I was not able to find much connection between Gravel and the capital move, but I have not gone through his papers extensively, so I don't know if there's more in there.
I was just going to type something in the chat that I think that he gave some money to the Alaska Division of Parks to have some people work on that Teflon City concept.
I would not be surprised. This is sort of the height of a lot of urban planning development in the United States in the 70s. It sort of starts in the 50s and kind of hits a height in the 70s. So there's a lot of wild stuff going around. I think because everyone got a little drunk on oil money. That's my theory.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And there is a message in the chat to Keely, just so people know that Sue was wondering if maybe there was confusion about who the Japanese people were, and that was it really Wada or was it somebody else? So something more for Keely to explore. Always something new, mysteries. So there's lots of things going on in the chat, and for people, I do save the chat text. So if anybody wants a copy of that and with the links or the resources that are posted, if you miss them as they're going through. Russ had a long message in there for you, Rachel, about ideas for a book.
Yes, I saw that. I'm not sure I'm quite ready to write a book, Russ, but I appreciate the
So anyway, I do save the chats as text files. So if you want that, just drop me an email and I'm happy to send that along to folks. And
Does Eric
again,
have time to put the clip of Marino? I mean, not to show
Yeah.
it maybe, but to put the
oh yeah,
link.
let's do that. Can you put that railroad clip up?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks.
Okay.
I just put it in.
Oh, okay. I said, you want to watch it right now or we done?
30 seconds. I could run it if you want.
Okay.
Maybe that can close us out. Karen, and when are we meeting again? What's the next session start?
Yeah, as Eric's pulling that up. So 1:30, the Chena Town site, which is our last session, with 2 presentations about the historic archaeology in the lost town of Chena here in Fairbanks. So that'll be at 1:30. And I will have Erik take us out with the train.
All right, thanks.
Maybe a bit anticlimactic, but live footage of that old Merino Roadhouse, which is always cool to see. Thanks for letting me show that.
I think that was a good wrap up. Yeah, thanks for finding that.
All right,
Excellent. All right, see everybody at 1:30.
All right. See